Hello and welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters. And if you are just joining us for the first time, this is the show where we talk about how things in Montpelier shake out for the rest of us. And this summer, we are talking about some of the bigger kind of system-wide issues in Vermont. And today we're talking to Scott Woodward, who is the former Deputy Commissioner of the Agency of Digital Services for the state and also a technology consultant. And very glad to have you on the show today, Scott.
Thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation.
And of course, we have regular contributor Emilie Kornheiser, who is speaking to us actually from Montpelier today. Long time since you've actually talked to us from Montpelier, so glad you're with us.
Yes, happy to be in Montpelier. Had meetings yesterday and today for some joint committee meetings, and it's the first time I've had meetings in real life in a long time now. It's been very interesting to try to navigate the politics with people in 3D.
Are you finding you need new skills, or you're brushing off old skills? Like what's kind of the growing pains these couple of days?
I forgot how uncomfortable the chairs are in the State House compared to my delightful office chair, which is, fine for an hour and not so okay for 6 hours. Not major suffering. And it's a lot of stimulation. We're doing everything in hybrid now so we can maintain the YouTube stream for the public, which I'm very excited about. But it means that I'm trying to think my thoughts and plan my remarks while it's very important to pay attention to what all of my colleagues are doing and sort of signaling. And then there's 4 enormous screens around the room where we have witnesses and some committee members, as well as the real live audience who also do a lot of signaling that's helpful to pay attention to. And then this meeting yesterday, I was co-chairing, so there was also sort of the responsibility of having the meeting run well. And so it was just a lot of stimulus for someone who mostly just sits on the computer and looks at the birds. So yeah, I'm excited about it though. I think, more can get done when we can look each other in the face. And so that will be good. And I am very happy that we're continuing the YouTube live stream because I think it's been really incredible for my constituents down in Brattleboro and for the local media, and all in all good for democracy. But my eyes still feel quite wide open from yesterday.
It's just a lot to take in. So Scott, I would love to touch base with you just quickly as someone who is deep into information technology.
Yeah.
And we have joked on this show about some of the debacles that have happened with state systems around IT.
Yeah.
And I'm curious from your perspective as someone who watches these sort of things and works on these sort of systems, what are your thoughts right now about where Vermont is with technology, especially given that it has had to make some leaps with like everything Emilie just talked about right now with COVID and being hybrid and Zoom and all these things.
Right. So a couple of things wrapped up in there. One is kind of like the general IT landscape and the landscape of projects that are underway and systems being implemented, maintained, and then there's the how do we work in IT these days in the pandemic. The first one first, I think at least purely from an IT perspective, IT folks are actually quite accustomed to working the way we have had to work during the pandemic. So it's not that big of a deal to have shifted to a remote style of working or working in a disconnected way, physically disconnected way. That's not new territory for IT people. So for instance, not in while I worked in Vermont, but I worked on a long-term project for the city of Denver. And I worked with people I never met ever. We never met once in person. And we worked on the project for 5 years. And it was an extremely successful project for people who never met in person. So that's kind of the norm for IT folks. So I would imagine it's been kind of a no hiccup situation for a lot of IT people during the pandemic. But to your larger question about IT projects, I'd say right off of the bat, I'm not that tuned into what's going on lately, the last like year or two. But prior to that, I was quite tuned into what was going on throughout the state with IT projects. And I think, I guess I would say I haven't talked to my former colleagues within ADS in a while, but I would say it takes a while for an organization, an IT organization, to transition to getting projects under control. And I know for quite a while that was the number one priority, was to rein in all the IT projects and identify them, get them under control, and figure out the path forward on all of them. I don't really know where that's at these days, but that is always a huge challenge and can actually take several years. It's not something you can turn around in just a short time. Although, having said that, that's no excuse certainly to not see progress. I would think the legislature would want to see marked progress on those kinds of efforts as time goes by.
I want to just jump in quickly, Scott.
Sure.
And one thing I love about some of the conversations we have on this show is we get to talk to people who are deeply engrossed in systems like you are.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about getting an IT system under control,
yeah.
As someone who just maybe logs into a state service, like let's say Vermont Health Connect or the unemployment system, my definition of an under control means I get whatever outcome I logged in to get.
Yeah.
What does that look like, though, under control mean for you as someone who's working on the back end of the system?
Yeah, great question. So your first point is actually right on. I mean, that ultimately that is the measure of what an under control or successful project is, whether the consumer, whether it's someone from the public or even someone within state government, is getting exactly the right outcome in the right time. But internally, the back end, a lot of that is around project discipline and process and following defined processes and having that, what I would call organizational discipline. That's not only important for an individual project, but it's actually important from an ongoing success standpoint. You can't, it's difficult to have repeated successes over and over again if you can't trust your own back end processes. And so that's why that kind of back end discipline is so critical.
Mm-hmm.
It's also really hard to achieve because at the end of the day, we're all, Vermont in particular, I would say, I have a lot of experience with other states, but Vermont is a little unique in that it's generally pretty resource constrained when it comes to IT projects. Because Vermont's a small state, there are limited resources to begin with. And that can be a challenge in achieving that kind of discipline I described, is when you have limited people who have to do their day jobs too.
Mm-hmm.
That becomes a really big challenge.
Mm-hmm.
We joke sometimes that the state's held together with duct tape and baling twine. And, in the last 2 years, I think the thing, you said that you haven't sort of had eyes on for the last year, but the things that have come up are sort of further explosions of systems that have been around for 30 years and we haven't updated, right? Like it's the unemployment system that's, like sub-DOS based, and the early childhood system to not be able to find like emergency pandemic care for essential workers. And so these systems that have been desperately in need of investment for a very long time, we suddenly see, we, meaning like decision makers with pocketbooks, decide finally that like, oh yes, IT is essential to invest in. And so there's two sort of questions that sit with me about this. One, you said that it's often we're resource constrained. And what it seems to me when we have these conversations is that because we're so small, we can't, like, there's no economy of scale in paying for a project like this.
Yeah.
And so having something designed for ourselves often is much too expensive because it still needs the same design specs as a much larger system. It's just a teeny system. So like the per Vermonter cost is really high. But when we buy off the shelf systems, it seems that we can never adapt them well to our magical Vermont specific policy goals, which are often quite different from other states' policy goals. So like really curious for your thoughts on that. And then I want to talk about like what it means to have IT meet policy needs, but that's a conversation.
Yeah.
That's a question for after.
Yeah, that's really good context. So that's a really good lead into, and it's not just a Vermont problem. This has been ever since off-the-shelf products started to emerge in the market back in the 90s, maybe even the 80s. That the quintessential challenge has been, well, what do? Do you change the system to accommodate your unique world, or do you change your unique world to fit the system? And that, my advice to legislators would be to ask a lot of questions, just as you're doing here, is to ask questions when you hear responses, and to say, well, why can't you change your process? Or why is Vermont so unique that you can't alter the policy? And as we know, sometimes policy changes mean statutory changes, which can be a big lift. But at the same time, those economies of scale and actual economies of buying and maintaining systems can be achieved by adapting the back-end processes to fit with the system rather than the other way around. And that, I think, this is a very general statement, but I've seen it many times over and over again. I've been working with government clients for 16 years now. And so in that 16 years, I've heard it many times, even in the private sector, that we're so unique, we can't change our processes to the way the system works, and therefore we can't leverage the advantage of an off-the-shelf product. But that, it's not really true. I mean, there are certainly unique circumstances where you can't change the process, but a lot of times you can, and that just becomes an organizational question, whether the organization wants to change.
Are you saying that we should match our policy and program systems to match existing available IT infrastructure rather than shifting IT infrastructure to match policy goals?
It's not, I'll try and think of a tangible example, but it's not quite as dramatic as that.
Okay.
I wish I could think of a really tangible example, but
I have a really good one. Can I give you one? Because it's a really
sure. Yeah, sure.
Okay. So liquor in Vermont,
yes.
New England state, in excess of liquor laws that are organized like pretty much in the same way they probably were in the 1800s for some reason.
Right.
And so what happens is liquor licenses have to be approved at the town level by the town liquor board, which is usually the select board. And there's a piece of paper that the applicant, I love this example because it was just sort of a funny story from yesterday. So there's a piece of paper that the applicant gives to the town, and then the town clerk signs off on with a check. And then they mail the piece of paper and the check to the state liquor board, who then cash the check and file it and do their own system of approvals and then send it back again.
Yep.
It's all done on paper.
Yep.
Things get lost all the time.
Right.
And my understanding is that during the pandemic, they set up a more paperless system where the towns could see what was happening along the paperwork's journey. And now that the pandemic's in a new phase, and some people think it's over, they aren't doing that anymore because they say they can't. And it's so interesting to me because we have so many other systems that town clerks use, like the tax system, or where there's a much cleaner flow of data because there's a shared data system between the town and the liquor department. But it seems like
Right.
they need the system to match the way they do things rather than
That is an
process.
excellent example. And I know that process very well, having served in local government for a long time. So I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah, that's a prime, and you could probably do a whole nother show on municipal IT, and that whole topic is ripe for discussion. But yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what's great about the example you cited is that, call it old habits, if you will, or old ways of doing things. And it's not to say that they're bad ways of doing things. It's just the way people get used to doing a certain way, things a certain way for years. And then somehow in the mind, it creeps in to think, well, we can't do it any other way. There's no other way to do it because that's the right way. Or there's something, it's easy to find something about the way you described getting a liquor license to say, well, we must maintain the way we're doing it. We've always done it. There's something really special about it. And oftentimes there's not. You just have to keep peeling back the layers and challenge that thinking, because again, knowing that process you described very well, that whole process could be put online just as you described. It could be expedited. It could go much smoother. Exactly, getting rid of the inefficiencies, just like you described.
So that makes sense to me.
Yep.
And then when I think of sort of what feels to me like a much more impactful example, I'm sorry to all the people trying to get liquor licenses, but the Department of Labor's unemployment insurance system. And what I imagine is, so hypothetically building a new IT system, have this ancient IT system that was really built around the only IT that was probably available at the time, maybe. But 40 years later, 30 years later, here we are. What there's a balancing act between is updating the IT system to match the existing processes because people are stuck in their processes, or adapting the processes to the new off-the-shelf IT system. But then there's the third option, which is the magic place where I want us to be, and I'm curious your thoughts on, which is, this is an incredible opportunity to deeply reflect on our process and how it meets the needs of Vermonters. And we do that first, and then we develop an IT system to match that.
You should be in IT.
I should not. No.
The way
I spend a lot of time with organizations doing process improvement, like for sort of like client experiences. So notes.
When I say you should be in IT, you should be not necessarily directly IT, but that thinking that you just described is spot on. And what you're hitting on is it's also, I don't call it a flaw, if you will, in the way IT projects are conceived. So, this is probably something we could talk a lot about in a different conversation, but I've long felt that the way that we come at IT projects is all wrong. What you just described about putting on the front end of the conversation, well, hey, here's an opportunity to reflect on our process. Let's do that. Let's do that thinking on the front end, rather than, because I can attest over and over and over again on so many IT projects, and it's not just a Vermont thing, that what you just described happens at the end of the process, and much too late. You can't affect change and you can't improve IT systems if you don't ask the question that you just posed at the end of the process. You have to do it at the beginning. And so if you have that conversation at the very beginning, say, put aside what you think is the right process, put aside what is off the shelf available through the software. Let's reflect on current process. How can we make it better? How can we affect better outcomes? And that should be the first step in the process. But that is not the norm in IT projects. It should be the norm. In some projects it is. It's not to say that it's never done, but in my experience, it's rarely done on the front end when it should be done. And I can say with confidence that, again, Vermont's not unique in this, but a lot of projects that have had challenges in Vermont, it is because that thinking did not occur on the front end.
So with the, sorry, Olga, I'm like super diving on.
No, go for it. I think it's a great question.
So I think the promise of ADS existing, and for our listeners who do not follow the machinations of agency creation and destruction as closely as, say, maybe I do, or Olga and Scott do, the Agency of Digital Services is a fairly new beast. And the idea was we wanted to have all the expertise related to state data systems in one place, rather than having a data person or a data team at each individual department or agency. So we can sort of streamline best practices better.
Yeah.
And so the person who supports that like process improvement conversation and that process sort of mapping conversation, does that person sit at ADS? And how much do they need to know about like the actual thing that's happening?
Yeah, you know, I don't really know. When I was at ADS, of course, at that time it was mostly getting the organization off the ground and getting the rudimentary pieces in place. You know, I don't know where that stands now.
Where do you think it should stand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know that and I can't remember Sue Zeller. I don't know if she's still around, but
yeah, she's
there's
still
a
the director
group
of performance. I'm confusing her title with Drew's title. What is her title?
Yeah.
Yes, she's still doing her awesome performance monitoring stuff. Yes. In the agency.
Right. So there's a tie-in with what, right. And there's a tie-in there with what you described with her work. But I you know, generally the way it works is you have a group of people that either float as part of maybe a project management office body that is either in IT or not in IT. It can go either way. And they may be a separate organizational change group, and they accomplish what you described. They have the skills. They have a similar skill set that what Sue Zeller Group teaches, and so they have those skills, and they kind of lead the organization through that step in the process. But again, I think you hit the nail on the head that is really one of the biggest challenges that oftentimes IT projects, you know, just dive in and start doing the project and don't think about rethinking.
I'm frozen, or you all are frozen. Wonder what will happen to our Zoom call. This is no good. Are you two there? Hello? Are you there?
So do you feel, how could the legislature
Whoa.
support IT systems in Vermont better? Are there other questions they could be asking? Is there other, be cursed? Oh, hello, welcome back. So we're going to take a quick break, everybody, and we will return in a moment.
Okay.
So we're not really taking a break. Thank you. Sorry about that. I think that you should record the second half from your computer, Olga. Can you do that? I'm frozen again. Shit.
There you are. You're back.
I think you should. Can you hear me? No.
Yeah.
Yes, you can. Okay.
Hear you. Yep.
Either I should give up.
We can hear you.
Okay. There's a huge delay. I think you should record the second half from your computer, Olga.
Okay.
How to do that?